So, Tashidele, Namaste, good afternoon, everyone. My topic is Buddhism and Modernity, threads from the Indian Tapestry, forgotten threads actually, the full title. And what I explore is the theme of Buddhism and modernity by dwelling on a historical moment in India when an encounter with the West via colonial modernity shaped a certain discourse of Buddhist revival in the land of its birth. As we know, Buddhism had, except for certain Himalayan regions, all but disappeared. So this emerges from my research into the fascinating life and times of Mahapandita Rahul Sankrityayayan, 1893 to 1963, a polymathic traveler, translator, scholar, who was part of the complex story of Buddhism's revival in India in the 20th century. These are just some of the epithets that you could use for him. He's known for his 4 epic journeys to Tibet in search of forgotten Buddhist texts, and for his amazing ability with languages. He knew about 36, according to one count, and he produced translations and editions of various lost texts recovered in Tibet. And he's also part of the institutional recovery of Buddhism in India. So he's part of that history, he's part of other histories as well. So traveling very far from his traditional Brahmin origins to finding in Buddhist philosophy a rich soil for his expanding universalistic, democratic, humanistic proclivities, Sankrityayan mastered Sanskrit and Pali in traditional contexts. He actually went to Vidyalankar Perivena. That's a picture I took 4 years ago, and they showed me his room. Because he couldn't study Buddhism in India. There was no space for it. He had to go to Sri Lanka. That's him becoming a bhikshu while there. He was born Kedarnath Pandey. Rahul Sankrityayan was his name as a Buddhist monk. And then traveling to Tibet in search of Mahayana Buddhist texts. After having mastered the Theravada Pali tradition, he was a lover of Sanskrit, and he was very keen on recovering that lost tradition, which was preserved in Tibetan translations. And one of his primary finds is Dharmakirti's Pramanvartika, the classic text of logic, which was that find was so significant that he was recognized by the likes of Sherbatsky, the great Russian Indologist, which complemented his prolific output as an explorer, translator, editor, historian, biographer, creative writer, and political activist. This is just a picture of him in Tibet. He traveled as a monk. It was an extremely dangerous, 4 extremely dangerous expeditions at great personal risk. It's an amazing story which I don't have time to tell here, but eventually supported by certain institutions after the discovery of some certain great things. And he wanted to keep that heritage in India. He had various offers from collectors in Europe to acquire those texts, but he donated them to the museum. Unfortunately, India hasn't been very diligent with preserving that heritage. So just his literary output at a glance, I called him a polymath, just to give you a sense of his wide range of interests. And what is interesting for me, particularly for us, because this is the Vajrayana conference, is that he recognized the value of Mahasiddha Sarahapa's Doha Kosh, which was neglected. He discovered the Tibetan and he restored it to its original. So that's one of his major contributions for our purposes. As we know, Saraha was the first Mahasiddha, and I'll talk a little bit more about why that is important for him. His co-travelers in this modernizing, reforming, reformist moment were people like Anagarik Dharmapada of Sri Lanka, Dharmanand Kosambi, who was a predecessor, Bhikshu Jagdish Kashyap, and Ananda Kausalyayan, with whom he made common cause for the recovery of Buddhism in India. People like Genghis Chopel, he was mentioned earlier. I'll come back to this. This is, of course, Genghis Chopel, recent work by Donald Lopez. Given Chopra was appointed his guide in Tibet, and then he traveled back with him in India. And of course, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, with whom he has a very interesting kind of non-overlap. It's an interesting, I've written extensively on that. So some of the sub-themes of the conference that this story, or rather stories, touch upon are the biographical approach to the Buddhist past, social engagement in Buddhism, translation and dissemination, the relationship between lay and monastic forms, Buddhist epistemologies in the light of Western or other epistemologies, comparative philosophy, sociology, and economics of Buddhist institutions, and Buddhist art and culture as aspects of the Indian and indeed the subcontinental civilizational heritage. So shaped by the context of colonialism, both as imperial oppression and an encounter with Western ideas and institutions, the story of Indian and indeed the subcontinent's reacquaintance with its Buddhist past is a story that necessitates a cross-disciplinary engagement that also calls for border crossings of all kinds. So you could use the term connected histories, which is a useful framework, I find, for dealing with this phenomenon. And you have to deal with archaeology, history, philology, translation, institution building, institution transformation, travel and recovery in the broadest sense of the term. Now, filtered through a gaze shaped by the needs of the hour of an anti-colonial upsurge and burgeoning nationalism. Remember, his dates are 1893 onwards, so he comes of age. Today's Gandhi Jayanti. He was also inspired by Gandhi to join the freedom struggle after the 1919 massacre. He went to jail as an activist for the Congress before changing his loyalties and sort of moving on. That's the context within which he is making this move. And I think we have to understand the dual needs of reform and recovery. So resistance and reform, as it were. Reform within and resistance to something outside. So the impetus for reform could come from Western influence, but it could also come from indigenous traditions, which were non-traditional. So that's a very interesting historical phenomenon. The late 19th century and the early 20th century is a fascinating period in Indian history where this is happening. Because you have a very mixed legacy of the European Enlightenment. On the one hand, it promises you liberty, equality, fraternity, etc. On the other hand, it's also providing support for, or turning a blind eye to imperialism and is supporting various forms of Eurocentrism. So how do we negotiate that duality is a question that I want to pose. So today, so European superiority and Eastern inferiority is also an aspect of the European Enlightenment. And that superiority would be racial, social, political, and intellectual. So today, of course, we have deconstructed much of this discourse, but the debates are still rife. When I think of Jamyang Khyentse, Norbu's, Rinpoche's interventions, for instance, he's sort of reminding you of that debate between Western liberalism and traditional forms of knowledge. So questions here arise of, how do we assert anti or post-colonial indigeneity? And what I'm trying to say is that you cannot reduce it to an us versus them dichotomy. It's not about, it's not so simple. It's a much more complex and layered narrative. And the questions that this raises are, how much of the baby of tradition do you throw out with the water of conservatism or superstition? Right? What is lost and gained in this process? Whose traditions and which traditions is one identifying with when we say we go back to tradition? Is tradition itself a static phenomenon? Aren't traditions always constantly under review? So these are the relevant and large questions which should frame, I think, our engagement with Vajrayana and modernity, or Buddhism and modernity. And of course, I can merely touch on some of these. So Rahul Sankrityayayan is, of course, my key protagonist here. So I'll go back to my image of him. This is an actual photograph. That's a stamp that the government of India brought out. It's a rather unflattering image of him. He was given the Padma Bhushan, though, one of the highest awards by the government of India, and the stamp commemorates that contribution. Now, he's only now being discovered by the English-speaking world because he was committed to writing in Hindi and in other languages. And if you don't write in English, you don't exist, as it were. And allowing myself an autobiographical digression, I will share that when I first suggested working on him for my PhD almost 20 years ago, my supervisor actively dissuaded me from following up on this. He called him a madman. He said, "Why are you working on that crazy fellow?" Subsequently, after I'd finished submitting and started sharing my work, Sankrityayan's remarkable genre-defying body of work and boundary-defying persona proved to be the most interesting for academic as well as non-academic audiences. I've shared at universities and places like in the India International Center, all kinds of audiences. So when it came to my postdoctoral work, I thought of him, and it was indeed, and the Fulbright committee agreed and sponsored, so I'm working on an intellectual biography. So 4 years ago, I found myself in Ann Arbor, where I met Professor Donald Lopez, who kindly gifted me a whole set of his recent works on Gedun Chopel, and I was very interested by the title there, The Madman's Middle Way, Reflections on the Reality of the Tibetan Monk Gedun Chopel, and I was struck by the coincidental repetition of the word mad, Rahul Sankrityayan being called a madman, and I wondered about what that might mean, and that's something we may want to think about. What does it mean, what is this madness of these two moderns that we're talking about? Is it some sort of a ceaseless quest? Is it the question, is it their ability and desire to challenge and push boundaries that renders them crazy? So the discourse of modernity, of course, requires a separate conversation around around especially the question of sanity and madness and rationality. But what's shared between the two of them is a challenge to the old order. I think that's the meaning of the modern that I want to take away, because that's what they share. And the third figure that I want to bring up is, of course, somebody we need to engage with if you're talking about Buddhism in modern India, which is, of course, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. The left, that's him at Columbia University. On the right is a recent stamp that was issued on him, and it commemorates his mass conversion of members of his community to Buddhism, right? So that's and he's a contemporary of Rahul Sankrityayan. I've engaged with that issue separately, but they don't really their lives don't really intersect as much as they should. Educated at Columbia and at the London School of Economics, Ambedkar is often hailed as a father of the Indian Constitution. He's, of course, the leader of a community of the most oppressed, those dubbed the untouchables, who are now referred most commonly as Dalits. He doesn't use the word Dalits. He's, of course, known for his 1956 mass conversion of members of his community to Buddhism, which was a mark of his personal spiritual conviction as well as a political gesture of defiance. This was based on a long study and analysis of the Buddhist scriptures, mostly the Pali tradition, and a detailed exposition of its central principles as a guide to a new kind of liberatory ideal. And this is interesting because the Buddha and his Dhamma is the book that he writes, which is his own interpretation of the received Buddhist tradition. He called it Navayana, Nava literally meaning new yana. So if you're talking about Theravada, Mahayana, Vajrayana, Tantrayana, there's also Navayana, which we have to look at. So it's a reformulation, really, of the received tradition based on what he considered to be of use to him. The Sangha is seen in his formulation as a form of communal life that seems to contain all that was good about something like Marxism, for instance, with its emphasis on egalitarian values and gender and class and caste equality, along with the rejection of a creator God or the Vedas as authority and rituals and ceremonies as path to liberation. Here's an excerpt in which Ambedkar notes, this is what he says about the Buddha. This is his interpretation. This is the Buddha denied the fatalistic view of karma. He placed the fatalistic view of karma, he replaced it by a much more scientific view of karma. He put new wine in old bottles. Transmigration was replaced by the doctrine of rebirth. He replaced the doctrine of moksha or salvation of the souls by the doctrine of nibbana. The Buddha Sasana is thus an original piece of thought. The little in it which is old is either modified or restated. One could argue that his own restatement of Buddhism is something that we could have a large debate about. So this is not the place for a detailed exposition of a comparative study of the divergences in the approach of Sankrityayan and Ambedkar to Buddhism, which I've dealt with elsewhere. It is useful to dwell on some of the issues to see how Buddhism could speak differently to two 20th century Indian thinkers, and both activists as well and scholars who were contemporaries, each concerned in his own way with the idea of liberation as a social, political, and spiritual goal. So Ambedkar gave a radical twist to the received tradition in which he took the progressive kernel from a complex history of Buddhism's many institutional forms as they existed in the early 20th century and as they presented himself for his study. He was inspired by figures like Dharmanand Kosambi, who had preceded him as a Marathi, a Brahmin though, who had been drawn to Buddhism and who had also attempted a kind of synthesis of socialist values with Buddhist values. Ambedkar's own driving impetus was, of course, his own experiences as of untouchability as a member of the caste called the Mahars. In Buddhism, he found and further forged in Navayana a religion suitable for his people and for the times, as a mass leader of the Dalits who had suffered systemic discrimination and as one of the founders of the modern republic. He was deploying Buddhism as a liberatory praxis for the downtrodden and indeed for the nation as a whole. So today, when we, I'm actually, the chakra forms very much a motif everywhere. I'm wearing the Dhamma chakra as well today. The blue of the Dalit movement is the blue of the chakra in the tricolor of the Indian flag, right? There is a very important connection with the recovery of the Buddhist tradition as a national symbol, which we need to think about. And in that process, if he found certain aspects of the received tradition unacceptable and not in consonance with what he felt was the essence of the Buddha's teaching, he felt free to discard them. For Sankrityayan, the move was different. He was a scholar, linguist. He'd been a sadhu in the, he'd studied Sanskrit and Pali, he'd studied Tibetan, Chinese, actually he taught himself French and German to study the European intelligence. So his understanding of religion came from textual study, as well as an exposure to institutional politics. Because he'd been in Vidyalankar Perivena, he'd gone to Tibet, he'd seen the monasteries. So what he was interested in was basically a more and more expansive vision of the world and an egalitarian vision of the world. It's also important to understand that he was a political activist who cut his political teeth with Gandhi, but also in the villages of Bihar, one of the poorest states in India, and he was a peasant leader. He was a mass peasant leader. And that also shaped his relationship with institutional religion, right? And led to him actually moving away from institutional religion towards Marxism, which he felt was more of a challenge to the class, hierarchies embedded in Indian society. At the same time, he continued to be a great believer in the Buddha as the epitome of human development. And he sort of humanizes the Buddha, much like Ambedkar. And you could see that as a modern element in their thinking, to the extent that modernism is uncomfortable with the transcendental and wishes to see everything in terms of the human. And he was also, of course, deeply committed, this is Sankrityayan, very deeply committed to the revival of, the lost glory of India. And one of the, and driven by an epistemological curiosity, which led him to Sri Lanka and so on. And I want to sort of talk about his connection with Gedul Chopel a little bit, because both of them were these kinds of questioning minds who got into trouble with the authorities for their adventurous nature. Skeptical, open-minded, and open to discovery. Chopel has also been called a modern visionary, and he's been rehabilitated by the works of Donald Lopez, but also recognized by someone like Venerable Samdong Rinpoche, a very traditional Lama in India, who describes Chopel as somebody who admires him for for his openness to technology, his use of the typewriter, someone possessed of immense artistic skill, for his freedom from narrow-mindedness, from his close attention to learning and knowledge, particularly towards research methodology, especially Western research methodologies, which are all signs of modernity, right? So it is a similar sort of openness to Western ideas, if they help, which Sankrityayan also displays. Although he's also deeply, interested in saying that Buddhist philosophy has extremely sophisticated philosophical ideas like dependent origination, pratitya samutpada, the doctrine of no self, anatta, and so on. He is a great admirer of the Buddhist logician Dharmakirti, whose sharp logic and epistemological interventions translated into a kind of brisk rebuttal of orthodoxy. And what he often quotes in his works, this is Sankrityayan, is the advice that the Buddha gives to his disciples to treat his teachings, to treat the Dhamma as a raft to carry one across rather than a load to be carried on the head. This is adapted from the Majjhima Nikaya, apparently, and this forms the epigraph to Sankrityayan's own autobiography, where he says that I have actually, I have that little quotation here, I have taken ideas as a raft to carry me across, not as a load to be borne on the head. And I think that's an important thought to keep in mind, which might also help us engage with Vajrayana more creatively. This takes me back to the figure of Sarahapa, who is, of course, the first Mahasiddha. And why is Sankrityayan interested in Sarahapa? It's again a complex equation. He's interested in Saraha as a democratic figure. He's interested in Saraha as the first poet in Hindi, as somebody who wrote in the Apabhransha, not in formal Sanskrit, right? Who spoke the language of the masses, and who inaugurated the Sahajayana, Sahaj implying ease, the path of ease, accessible to everybody, spontaneity. It's a life-affirming, world-affirming path, right? Which is revolutionary in moving away from, the authority of textual traditions and traditional sources to validate individual experience. That's what the Siddhas do, the 84 Mahasiddhas, if you look at that. And if you actually do a sociological analysis of the Mahasiddhas, you will also notice that they come from social groups which are considered to be the downtrodden, right? They would be women. Dombipa, the name itself indicates the caste. Sarahapa was a Brahmin, but he was, his teachers were women, women of the, he's an arrow making, the arrow maker, actually he's called the arrow that pierces illusion, but also, the two women who are his teachers. So the role of women, the role of so-called untouchables, or people who are not highly educated panditas, which is so important in the tradition of the Siddhas, that appeals to the democratic proclivities of Rahul Sankrityayan. And that's the connection with Vajrayana that I want to make, because Sara is actually is seen as the founder of one of the founders of Vajrayana. So I will end here and take any questions that may arise from this presentation. End with this thought again, for us to reflect on tradition and modernity, keeping this teaching of the Buddha in mind. Do the teachings become a load, or do they become a raft? Are they a means, or are they an end in themselves? Right? And of course, in Zen Buddhism, we have very radical interpretations of this. So I'll stop there. Thank you.